Operation Ten-Nichi-Go was the last major Japanese naval operation of World War II. The Japanese battleship Yamato, the largest battleship in history, and 9 escorts left Japan for the war's biggest suicide mission. Here are 5 unbelievable, little-known facts about this remarkable operation. On March 26, 1945, U.S. naval intelligence intercepted and decrypted Imperial Japanese Navy radio signals mentioning Operation Ten-Ichi-Go, Heaven Number 1. In the days that followed, more intercepts yielded ever more detailed information about the operation. On April 5th, senior U.S. Navy commanders in the Pacific, including Admiral Raymond Spruance, commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, had detailed information on the operation's timing, order of battle, and plan of action. According to the plan, Yamato, the light cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers would form a surface suicide attack force that would transit to Okinawa and sink as many troop transports as possible before beaching and firing ashore batteries until they ran out of ammunition or were destroyed. Any survivors would abandon the ship and fight to the death on land alongside their Army colleagues. Before dawn on April 6th, 15 hours before Yamato and her escorts set sail, Spruance ordered his fleet to prepare for an attack on the Japanese fleet. He stationed 2 U.S. submarines near the departure port and issued strict orders to report rather than attack. Spruance intended to sink all of the Japanese ships by having them sail into a trap he was laying. Upon being briefed on the mission, Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, the commander of the Ten-Ichi-Go force, initially opposed it, considering it a pointless waste of resources. Nonetheless, on April 5th, he laid out the details of the mission to the Japanese ship captains who would carry it out, resulting in the closest thing to a mutiny experienced by the Japanese Navy. They unanimously objected, believing that the fleet would get nowhere near Okinawa, with many arguing that they should be allowed to conduct independent raids on the overextended U.S. supply lines instead. The Chief of Staff of the combined fleet, Vice Admiral Ryonosuke Kusaka, flew in from Tokyo to ensure that Ito would follow the directives. Kusaka summoned senior officers and ship captains aboard the cruiser Yahagi for a tense meeting. None of them feared death. They simply objected to the utter foolishness of attacking the entire U.S. Navy in broad daylight without air cover. One of the captains said the mission was like throwing an egg against a rock for all the good it would do. Kusaka listened to their concerns before pulling out his ace card. He misled the officers by claiming that the mission was what the emperor wanted and was an order. When a living god gave a command, they had little choice but to obey and accept the plan. They did obtain a concession in which all sailors would be given the option of not participating in the operation. Before departing, Ito attempted to save as many as feasible by emptying the sickbay and ejecting trainees and men nearing retirement. 67 naval cadets who had arrived on the battleship 3 days earlier were also put ashore, though many had to be dragged off while begging to stay. The ship's crews were assembled and briefed on the nature of the mission and given the opportunity to stay behind if desired, an option none of them took. As sailors finished their shore leave, they said their final goodbyes to their wives and children, whom they would never see grow up. Yamato and her escorts left Tokuyama Harbor at 4 o'clock on April 6 to begin their one-way mission. Admiral Spruance, commander of the United States Fifth Fleet, reacted quickly to the report from the submarine USS Hackleback that it had sighted the Japanese fleet. Spruance directed Rear Admiral Morton Deo, commander of the Battleship Bombardment Force, to deploy his 6 old battleships, later joined by 6 modern battleships, to form a blocking force northwest of Okinawa and be ready for a surface battle the following evening. At 10 o'clock the following morning, Deo held a planning conference on his flagship, the USS El Dorado, with plans to intercept the Yamato and her escorts that evening and destroy them with an overwhelming surface force that would include 12 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 21 destroyers. The battleship-centric doctrines that had dominated U.S. naval strategy for much of the 20th century came to an abrupt end following the attack on Pearl Harbor. Since then, the battleships have been reduced to providing shore bombardment and anti-aircraft artillery support for the aircraft carriers, which now play a critical role in all major Pacific battles. The upcoming battle against the largest battleship in history would emphasize the capabilities of U.S. battleships and restore some pride to the battleship commanders. At 11 o'clock, Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, who oversaw Task Force 58, the 5th Fleet's carrier strike force element, launched an aerial onslaught from 15 carriers in the direction of the Japanese fleet without alerting his immediate superior. When Spruance asked what was going on, he claimed to have misunderstood his orders, but since they were already on their way, he might as well let the airstrike continue. In the event that the airstrikes were unsuccessful, he suggested using Deo's surface fleet as a backup option. Spruance conceded and informed Deo of the change in plans. Deo knew from experience that once the carriers had finished with the Japanese fleet, there would be nothing left to shoot at. Despite his anger with the decision, he had little choice but to comply. As usual, those damn flyboys would take all the glory for themselves once again. Yamato was the lead ship in a class of 2 nearly identical super battleships. She and her sister ship, Musashi, were the largest and most powerfully armed battleships ever built, weighing 72,000 tons. The Musashi sank 6 months prior to the Ten-Ichi-Go operation in the Sibuyan Sea during the Battle of Leyte Gulf and became, in effect, a live-fire tutorial for U.S. carrier aviators on how to efficiently dispatch a super battleship. By the time of Operation Ten-Ichi-Go on April 7, 1945, U.S. air groups had translated those lessons into clear doctrine with dramatic results. What took all day and a large number of hits against Musashi was accomplished against Yamato in about 2 hours, with far fewer total hits. Over the course of several hours, Musashi absorbed about 19 torpedoes and 20 bombs before capsizing. Torpedo strikes in the multi-wave assaults on Musashi were essentially balanced on both sides. The ship was kept largely upright for a considerable amount of time with the minimal use of counterflooding. This saved Musashi valuable time as the flooding progressed, giving damage control teams the time they required to restore fire main pressure and watertight integrity. The lessons learned were analyzed and converted into clear doctrine for future use by U.S. air groups. As was shown the previous year, the upgraded Mark 13 torpedo was a more dependable ship killer than armor-piercing bombs when used against a ship with as much armor as the Musashi. As a result, dive bombers and fighters armed with rockets were used to suppress anti-aircraft fire and disrupt damage control. The initial missions of Hellcats and Helldivers were to suppress fire control, rattle gun crews, and prepare the tactical and psychological environment for the torpedo phases. The Avengers then emerged into a defensively shocked environment rather than an unaffected wall of flak. Torpedo distribution was the most significant change, with U.S. strike leaders instructing their squadrons to focus hits on one side and continue piling them in. Beyond simply tilting a ship over, a prolonged same-side list drowns low-mounted anti-aircraft guns, makes steering more difficult, and above all, forces severe counterflooding on the opposite side, which lowers reserve buoyancy and sets the ship up to roll past the point of recovery. The most efficient method of capsizing was this deliberate one-sided focus, and it worked remarkably well. Yamato's anti-aircraft defenses were gradually increased throughout the war to counter the growing threat posed by aircraft. By 1945, the number of 5-inch dual-purpose guns had doubled to 24 barrels, while the number of 25mm AA cannons had risen from 24 to an astonishing 132 barrels. However, while her anti-aircraft battery appeared formidable on paper, it had serious drawbacks. Because Japan, unlike the U.S., lacked proximity fuse shells, their heavy dual-purpose guns used time fuses, which were substantially less effective against maneuvering aircraft. Meanwhile, the outdated 25mm gun had inferior sights, a limited traverse rate, severe vibration that made it inaccurate, a propensity for blockages, and small magazine boxes that limited the rate of fire. Despite the amount of lead Yamato's guns could fire into the air, their poor performance was not surprising given their antiquated fire control procedures, in comparison to U.S. ships that had adopted state-of-the-art radar-directed guns and proximity-fused shells. So why wasn't she saved by the 16-inch thick armored belt? At the time of Yamato's construction, Japanese naval engineers lacked the specialized tools and engineering techniques needed to weld 16-inch armor plates. As a result, the Japanese shipbuilders were forced to use the tried and tested riveting method. The disadvantage of this method was that the joint strength was determined by the toughness of the rivets that held the plates together. Furthermore, holes must be drilled in the armor plating to perform the riveting process, which can compromise the seam's structural integrity. When torpedoes struck Yamato, her armor remained intact, but the rivets were blown off and water began to flood in around the joints, resulting in significant flooding. The extraordinary skill of Yamato's captain in making evasive maneuvers to throw off aim and avoid numerous bombs and torpedoes did more to keep her alive than anything else during the initial phase of Operation Ten-Ichi-Go. With powerful engines delivering mid-20-knot speeds and a responsive helm, she could zigzag aggressively and swerve incoming torpedo tracks, turning toward the threat to narrow her target angle and spoil drops. Several early attacks were countered in this manner before her luck ran out and she was struck by a torpedo. She swiftly began to list after taking on almost 3,000 tons of water, but effective counterflooding quickly fixed the list. However, it significantly slowed the battleship and made her maneuvering difficult, making her less able to avoid follow-on attack waves that landed more hits, further reducing speed, an irreversible downward spiral that led to her demise. Press that like button and don't forget to ring the bell icon so you don't miss the next video. Check out my channel page for more great videos like this one.